are very pleased that to have a speaker here today. Dr. Maya Gislason is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University and Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research Scholar. She guides research teams in developing equity, diversity, and inclusion approaches to climate change in service of planetary health. A defining characteristic of Dr. Gislason's research is the integration of social inequities in health scholarship with ecosystem approaches to health, which highlights the interconnection between human, animal, and environmental health. So we look forward to a fabulous talk, and I will turn it over to you, Maya, for your talk this morning.
Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. And I am going to just share my screen because I have some slides I want to share with you. And I'm going to invite you into my world here, which is a little cabin that I'm on the west coast of Vancouver Island in the Northern Gulf Islands in British Columbia. So indeed, I do want to just take about 15 minutes just to share some of the work that I'm doing around how we are preparing for the future by taking equity-informed approaches to developing a new generation of evidence, and particularly devoting those efforts to understanding the space between environments and health in new and exciting ways. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and to Dr. Hallstrom. It's really lovely to be able to share in this space. I would also like to acknowledge that where I am on the Discovery Islands are the traditional territories of the Klahoose, the Hamalko, the Kwakiutl, and Tla'amin people, and they have been here since time immemorial as stewards and holders of health and wellness and sustainability in these places where also the land and water heal. And so in this work, part of it is very much being informed by place and being informed by the traditional knowledge keepers and wisdom holders that constantly teach me about how to think in decolonizing ways about this interface. I have become very curious about the Prentice Institute. I realize that this is a place where you think big picture. You think about the big problems that are facing our world, and take time to understand how we're going to move the dial in innovative and groundbreaking ways in terms of responding to the issues that are at all of our doorsteps. So I thought it was appropriate to take a moment to begin my thoughts for you by turning to the 2020 Global Crisis Report of the World Economic Forum. Now, this report are articulating what they see are the top 10 risks over the next 10 years that are going to be playing out in the global arena. And what we see here is that of those 10, they've categorized 5 as environmental issues. So they're talking about extreme weather events, they're talking about natural disasters, about biodiversity loss, but they're also placing these environmental issues within relationship to human activity. So looking at human-made environmental disasters, and also looking at climate change, not only as a threat, but as an issue that is being precipitated by a failure of humans to act. If you look across the screen, you also see that there is a red dot, a societal dot, water crisis. And what they've done is they've depicted how important this environmental catastrophe is and the governance issues around it to the social world. And so we can begin to see, if we take a little step back and we look at the big problems, that in addition to economic issues, the asset bubble, for global governance failures, cyber attacks, and debt and fraud theft, that we are looking at a characterization of our big issues on the horizon as having eco or ecological system dimensions and social system dimensions. And so this gives us a signal about how we need to be thinking and what we need to be doing in order to really become ready and able to respond in very nuanced and meaningful ways to the risks and challenges ahead of us. Um, so we also know when we are looking out at this horizon that we are working within a research context in the Canadian setting where there's a big drive to bringing issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion to the center of our Canadian research enterprise. The idea that the Government of Canada is promoting is that if we take this kind of equity-informed thinking, we're going to excel in research excellence. We're going to be increasingly innovative. Our research will be increasingly impactful. And through advancing knowledge and understanding in these ways, we are better positioned to respond to local, national, and global challenges. So I often work with federal and provincial governments to start to try and think about how do we actually take these equity, diversity, and inclusion mandates and move them into the research arena, into that evidence building space. These are not just aspirational ideas. The government is also proposing and promoting a suite of tools, approaches, and processes for doing this kind of work. You are probably very familiar, if you've spent time in tri-council funding environments, with the request to do thinking around intersectionality, that theoretical idea that people have complex identities, social locations, and lives, and that they play out to impact their experience in the social world across their life course. And that not only is our race, our sexuality, our ability, our gender, our incomes, and so on impacting our lives, but it's doing so because of the relationship between ourselves as agents and the structures of society, those institutions of education, economy, religion, and so on. So we take this theoretically driven idea and we have the challenge then to operationalize it, to figure out how do we bring these theory-informed insights into actual practice. The figure on the right-hand side is just giving you one idea of how do we take these theoretical ideas and turn them into variables? How do we understand their interactions? And then how do we actually gather data and build evidence that takes this complexity and places it into a structural analysis? So these are some kind of the unpacking tasks that need to happen when we're looking at equity informed evidence building. We also know, and it was acknowledged at the beginning of this meeting as well, that in the Canadian context, we have a commitment and a need to do work that is decolonizing our research, decolonizing our ways of seeing, of partnering, of agenda setting, of co-creating, of working, of doing that through a way that is informed by two-eyed seeing. So this idea on the left-hand side of the screen that we are trying to look at issues through the eyes of Western science, but also through Indigenous worldviews. And this is an interesting task because we are looking at changing our epistemic approach. We're looking at not simply going for, this bifurcated notion of people and place, but trying to understand how do you analyze, build knowledge, build evidence around collectivity, connectivity, people that have sacred hearts and sacred relationships to one another and to the planet. And so this really takes a lot of stopping and rethinking. It takes centering Indigenous voices, naming the politics of coloniality, as we've done in the beginning of this meeting, demythologizing hegemonic beliefs, disrupting epistemologies and having kind of this diversity of worldviews, and doing emancipatory rereadings of things. So that is part of the work, and it is patient and thoughtful work indeed. There is also the challenge, and you're probably very familiar with it. When you try and turn the dial on equity-informed research, we deal with data gaps. We deal with trying to figure out how data can be thought about in reflective ways and the different functions that data serves. When we're also working in equity informed research, we have a lot of data silences. We just haven't been gathering data in the Canadian context that we need to speak meaningfully about issues such as sex and race and gender. And so we're in the current process of redressing some of that, for example, through Stats Canada's current innovations. We also have to approach what we think of as valid knowledge. For example, when we're doing gray lit reviews, in conjunction with academic literature reviews, we're really inviting in how people speak to us through literature and how we bring voices from community into our academic reviews. This work also requires doing a lot of mixed methods research. We can't just go and do what we're used to doing. We actually have to think about how do we work with numeric data, but also how do we bring in the voices of community through case studies, through in-depth interviewing. And to do that, how do we actually build into our research horizon the importance of having relationships with communities, partnering with Indigenous researchers and knowledge holders, doing intersectoral work, and so on. So it takes a shift in the culture of doing research when we're foregrounding equity issues. We also have to wade into that thorny space of recognizing that data are not objective, that power and perspective are folded in to our data gathering and evidence building processes. So this is not just that age-old thing of, the hard and soft sciences, the natural and social sciences, and what is more valuable or what offers more valid or concrete knowledge, but rather really working in the nexus between these different ways of knowing and thinking and gathering data. And when I work, for example, with our big data hub at the university, at Simon Fraser University, it's really interesting conversations when I begin to talk to the AI folks and the machine learning folks and the big data folks about the fact that bias is folded into our data. Everything from who's funding research and what they're funding and why they're funding it, to how we're designing projects, how we're collecting data, what we say we have enough time to do and what we say is not important, what we're willing to leave on the cutting room floor, how we analyze work, how theory informed are we? Talk to a data scientist in a big data space about theory informed research. These conversations are complicated, they take time, they take patience, and thinking through to everything through to our knowledge mobilization. How do we communicate and distribute out knowledge? Who gets this knowledge? Who needs this knowledge? And how do we need to be sharing this knowledge? So these are all part of the data and evidence landscape that we work in. I wanted to give you a little snapshot of what one tiny piece of research looks like based on work I did for Women and Gender Equality Canada. The question they asked was, how do we build predictive models that help us understand the impacts of climate change across Canada on different populations, on equity deserving populations? Well, that was an interesting question because when we're trying to build these models, we have to think in a very iterative and incremental way through them. So when I get asked questions like this, I assemble teams like the wage composition team, the circle you see below. You can't really see the words, they're too small, but in my team, I have sociologists, I have health equity scholars, big data developers, environmental health consultants, geospatial modelers, critical theorists, health impact assessment specialists, and so on, because we have to be able to look at the problems in a holistic way. The other thing that happens is when we're working at that human environment community interface, we have to not only take these intersectional ideas and operationalize them, looking for how do we actually find meaningful ways of looking at bringing to life the experiences of different populations. But we also have to look, for example, with climate change, at these different kind of temporal axes. We have to look at acute and immediate disasters. We have to also understand seasonal trends over time, and also how gradually we have environmental issues unfold. So that temporal space is really important. And then we have scales of impact, impacts to the individual level, acute health impacts, community level impacts, ecological level impacts. So it's a very complicated kind of way of trying to understand the theoretical question through an equitable lens. And so this work takes a high degree of resilience in the face of complexity and systems thinking. And so I think what we can say is that we're developing a new area of working on eco-social equity. A lot of my colleagues tell me I'm doing intersectional sustainability. But it also requires us thinking about not only how to bring these data landscapes together, but to extend our ideas of what is equity and who is equity deserving. So we have to think about multi-species equity in order to understand pictures. And COVID-19 has really shown us our interdependence between human, animal, and environmental health. And that has to be part of our equity landscape. Intergenerational equity is also important. What are the moral and ethical responsibilities of current generations to future generations? And climate change is a way of illuminating the importance of this equity lens. And then Indigenous sovereignty as a form of actually working on sustainability is a very powerful way to take a decolonizing lens and be not only working in that eco-social sustainability frame, but advancing Indigenous rights, freedoms, and knowledge. And so what I want to leave you with is this idea that when we're doing this work, it's not only that integrated notion of equity, it's not only this idea of health and all policies, but it's also this whole of government and whole of society approach that is required to reduce inequities. And this approach, and I think the Prentice leadership is really actively thinking about this, actually requires new ways of thinking. It requires new forms of leadership. It requires shifts and allocations of power, and probably decentralized weakening of centralization, and really rethinking top-down decision-making structures to allow equity-seeking groups and deserving groups to have voice, to allow communities to make a difference in how we think about and move to action on research, and how we create a new data environment in our work. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and think alongside of you for a short time this morning.